Hi, this is Ms. Klemme, and welcome to the podcast on mechanisms of disease. Today we're going to begin our discussion of disease with a kind of morbid thought, and that is the major causes of death for kids your age, 15 to 24. Right off the bat on this line graph, you can see the majority of peers your age are going to die of unintentional injuries like car accidents. However, I don't want to pay too much attention to that on this video. I'm going to pay attention to this chunk, this 25% chunk. That's the deaths due to various diseases, cancer, heart disease, and everything else under that umbrella. That's a pretty broad umbrella, and we're going to look at the specifics today. So, without further ado, I want to begin with the prefix patho. That's where everything starts. And the word patho actually just means disease. So we can put some different stems on that prefix to mean different things. For example, we can put the stem ology on that. And pathology is the study of disease. We could combine the two words pathogenesis to mean the study of basically how a disease develops, its pattern. We could even put together the words pathophysiology to take a look at the study of the disease mechanism. How does it actually work when it infects a human being? Now together, if you put all these prefixes and stems together, you get something that a pathophysiologist or just simply a pathologist would study on a day-to-day basis. They would study the pathogenesis, how it develops, the pathophysiology, the mechanism of the disease. But before we get ahead of ourselves too far, let's distinguish, in fact, what is disease and what is health. Well, the disease really comes down to anything that's not normal in your body. And health isn't just the absence of that abnormality, it's the whole picture. It's the physical well-being, the mental, and the social. So keep in mind, it's not just the absence of disease, it's the whole picture. Now there's a few other disease key vocabulary terms that you should be responsible for. And the first is something called a sign. And a sign is something we can measure. For example, a lab test. If you have to get your blood drawn, that's an objective thing that we can study and say, yes, you have the signs of this, or a rash, or a lesion. Those are all signs. A symptom, on the other hand, is more subjective. Like, oh, I'm having muscle aches, or I have a stomach ache, or stomach pains. I'm feeling nauseous. There's no test out there that can determine whether or not you're nauseous. It's subjective. Now, when you combine both signs and symptoms, you get a syndrome, which is the collection of both. For example, Down syndrome. We can go in and have blood drawn and a DNA analysis to determine, yes, this individual has Down syndrome. That's a sign. But there are other symptoms that go along with that. The same with something like fetal alcohol syndrome. Signs and symptoms. Some more terminology. First is etiology. This is anything that could potentially cause a disease. For example, if we look at something called tinea. Sorry, it's terrible penmanship. Tinea is athlete's foot. We know all of the factors that cause athlete's foot. In fact, we know that athlete's foot is caused by a fungus. However, and unfortunately, a lot of diseases are idiopathic. We don't know their cause. Something like cancer. We may know, some diets and some lifestyle habits lead to it, but we're not exactly sure of what is the root main cause. Related back to signs and symptoms, acute signs and symptoms have to do with the short term. For example, a cold. If you have a cold, you know that stuffy nose is eventually going to go away. Whereas something that's chronic, Like say you have a disc that's misplaced in your back and you have chronic back pain. That's something that's not going to go away and could in fact get worse with time. Now we're at the part in the podcast where we really dive into mechanisms of disease. How does the disease actually infect? So we'll look at 8 different mechanisms, and you should know all 8. There's a category of pathogens, of different parasites. And this one is, over here, is somebody infected with sickle cell anemia. And that's a parasite that you can get if you get bit by the Anopheles mosquito. Over to the right is something that's a genetic cause. Oops, ran out of room there. That little boy has Down syndrome. That's a mechanism. In this corner, oops, we have viral infections such as Ebola. This one down here is a baby or a boy that's been paralyzed by the polio virus. And how does our body fight these? We try and slow down infections by getting a fever. And this is a picture of a white blood cell trying to kill off bacteria. So now, without further ado, we're going to go into detail on the 8 different mechanisms of disease. So what I'll do is I'll give you the first mechanism, like in this case, a genetic mechanism, and then I'll tell you a few examples of those. So the first mechanism, there it is genetic, and this is when your genes are mutated. Some examples of this include something as simple as, say, color blindness. But it could also be more severe, like cystic fibrosis. The next mechanism is pathogens. This is a big category, and we'll actually look more in depth in a later podcast. Pathogens could be viral, they could be bacterial, they could be fungal, they could even be caused by a microorganism called a protist. Okay, any sort of infection caused by a foreign living thing. Next mechanism is cancer, and this is any abnormal tissue growth. This is cell division gone wild. And again, we'll look at cancer in more detail in a later podcast. Some examples of cancer include malignant melanoma, skin cancer. Includes leukemia, a blood cancer, specifically of the white blood cells. We also have physical and chemical agents. If you're exposed to anthrax, if you're a miner and you get the black lung, cigarette smoke, other carcinogens in your environment would all be examples of this mechanism. Another mechanism is malnutrition, not getting the right amounts of food or the right types of food. For example, scurvy. People joke about this as pirates often got scurvy, but what it boils down to is just a lack of vitamin C. And on their ships, they could not keep fruit fresh to get their daily dose of vitamin C. Another one, not so serious as scurvy, but something as simple as night blindness, could be caused by malnutrition, could be caused by lack of vitamin A. The halfway point here, the fourth disease mechanism is autoimmunity, and this is when your body actually attacks itself. An example of this would be, let's start over here, is rheumatoid arthritis. You may have seen pictures of this. This is where your joints and your fingers especially get really inflamed because your body is attacking those joints for some reason. Another autoimmune disease would be MS, multiple sclerosis. This is where your body starts attacking your neurons and your nervous system, actually eats away at the insulation of those nerve wires so that they can't conduct messages as clearly or as quickly. Next up is inflammation. This is your body's response to some invader or some irritant, and the best example that I can come up with is allergies. Allergies include your body's response to pet dander or pollen or mold. It's when your body overreacts to a really harmless irritant. Um, but other irritants could be just as simple as a cut on your finger. And you go through this whole inflammation pathway to treat that cut. Next one up is degeneration. This is just a simple breakdown of tissue. It can be as simple as osteoarthritis, which is different than rheumatoid. Osteoarthritis is just simply when the cartilage breaks down on your bones and your bones are grinding bone to bone. A more serious case of degeneration would be Alzheimer's, in which case the brain tissue does start to degenerate, does start to break down. And finally, now that we're done with all the disease mechanisms, the pictures you see here are of a disease that ravaged the U.S. in the early 1900s, and that's polio. And polio was a virus that was really easy spread from person to person. As you can see here, this is an entire polio ward in a hospital. And what happened was in polio, that virus would actually paralyze your diaphragm, which helps you inhale and exhale. So what they did was they put individuals in iron lungs. It was this pressurized chamber that helped manually inhale and exhale your lungs so that you could still breathe. And that's what polio did to thousands of people before we got a vaccine for it. But thankfully, there were epidemiologists. These are individuals that studied epidemiology. Where does it occur? Is it spread in just little pockets? Is it localized? How does it spread worldwide? How does it spread in the country that you're living in? So these people would study the epidemiology of polio in hopes of trying to minimize those infected. And still today, you can get a job as an epidemiologist studying global infections like SARS, for example, or the bird flu, avian flu, if you will. Epidemiology gives you the whole global picture of disease. And we're just about finished. This is the last slide. And I thought I'd put this on here because it really brings to your attention some really important information on disease and all of these different mechanisms. And there are various risk factors. For example, genetic risk factors. The disease sickle cell anemia actually is a strong occurrence in African American populations. So if you're in that particular gene pool, you're more at risk for that disease. Another one is age. Think about earaches. You get earaches when you're a little kid. Think about prostate cancer. Little kids do not get prostate cancer. So some diseases you're more susceptible to based on your age. Lifestyle. This is a pretty obvious one. There's exercise habits, eating habits, and even your occupation can put you at risk. Stress. Stress is a huge component into having high blood pressure. So that's a risk factor you can put yourself at. Ulcers are not caused by stress, but they can get worse and more induced via stress. Environmental factors, pollution. If you live in an area that has parasites that are contaminating the water, puts you at more risk for certain diseases. And the last one is pre-existing conditions. So say, for example, that you had bone cancer when you were in high school. And you were treated with chemotherapy and with radiation. And you got cured. You were in remission. Then, when you were 40, you got diagnosed with thyroid cancer. And the doctor said, you know what, you got thyroid cancer because you received radiation. So having that radiation when you were younger gave you a pre-existing condition and put you at risk for another type of cancer. And that does happen. That's very common with cancer patients that receive radiation. Now, when you put all these together, and this does make sense, when you have more and more risk factors, you have, unfortunately, a better chance of getting a disease. So that's a basic overview of disease mechanisms. When you write your disease paper, you're going to have to use these terminology, these vocabulary words, and these mechanisms to clearly articulate your disease topic. So I hope this is helpful on that. Thanks for listening.